Blackwater was founded, it was actually incorporated in late 1996 and really started to build up its operations in 1997. Originally, it was a 5,000-acre plot near the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina and the personal private fortune of its founder, Erik Prince. He's believed to be, if not the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest people ever to serve in the elite U.S. Navy SEALs. Maybe we should talk for a moment about who he is and his background, because it has everything to do with the success of the company. Erik Prince comes from a very wealthy right-wing Christian dynasty in the town of Holland, Michigan. His father was a man named Erik Prince, who was a sort of pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps capitalist. He built up an empire called the Prince Manufacturing Corps, and they manufactured auto parts, serviced the auto industry. And in fact, what the company is perhaps best known for was for creating the now ubiquitous lighted sun visor. So when you pull down the visor in your car and it lights up, that's the Prince family's invention. And it was a very profitable business. And so young Erik Prince grew up in this very heady atmosphere that mixed the sort of free market gospel with the literal Christian gospel. His family they were strict Calvinists. And Erik Prince was political at a very early age and watched as his father used his company as a cash-generating engine to fuel the rise of what we now know as the religious right in this country, as well as the Republican Revolution of 1994. His father gave the seed money to Gary Bauer to found the Family Research Council. Young Erik Prince was in the first crop of interns to serve at the Family Research Council. They gave significant funding to James Dobson and his group Focus on the Family, which is now sort of the premier evangelical organizing network in this country, the Prayer Warriors. And what's interesting is that Erik Prince's sister Betsy married into another powerhouse Michigan family, perhaps the single greatest bankroller of the Republican Revolution, Dick DeVos's Amway Corporation. Erik Prince's sister married Dick DeVos, the heir to the Amway fortune. And Amway was a company that sold home services products and sort of was accused of running the operation like a cult and using their marketers to not only sell their products, but to sell their political agenda, the rise of the sort of Christian right and Republican Revolution. And so this marriage of these two families was sort of typical of the merging of the monarchist families in old Europe. And so Erik Prince grew up in this atmosphere where his family was a real power player in what would become the Republican Revolution of 1994. Erik Prince interned in George H.W. Bush's White House, but he complained that it wasn't conservative enough for him on gay issues, on the balanced budget, on the environment. He also was an intern for the conservative California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, a man who, after leaving Reagan's staff as an advisor and speechwriter, went over to join the Mujahideen in Afghanistan before beginning his congressional term. And so Erik Prince
to fight the Soviets.
To fight the Soviets, and he bragged of having gone over there to stand alongside the freedom fighters. Those very freedom fighters now being the ones who have declared war on the Bush administration, and that the Bush administration claims to be at the center of the so-called war on terror. So that was those were the early days of young Erik Prince, and then he went on to join the U.S. Navy SEALs. And I don't think he wanted to leave the Navy SEALs, but his father died in 1995, and his wife had cancer, and it became no longer an option to be a Navy SEAL. Prince had been in Bosnia, he'd been in Haiti, he'd served in the Mediterranean, and so he sort of came home in the mid-90s to help the family sort through its affairs and to also take care of his ailing wife. And the family ended up, after much deliberation, selling Prince Manufacturing for a little less than $1.5 billion in cash. And Erik Prince took his political experience, his religious commitment, and the experience he gained from watching his father become a major operator in politics and business, and opened Blackwater. And he teamed up with several other former Special Forces guys. And Blackwater was founded on the principle of anticipating accelerated government outsourcing of training and firearms-related training. And so that's how Blackwater began. It was supposed to be like a sportsman's paradise / training center in the wilderness of North Carolina.
You begin your book by talking about a speech of Donald Rumsfeld's the day before the September 11th attacks.
Right. On September 10th, 2001, Donald Rumsfeld gave one of his first major addresses as Defense Secretary. And gathered before him was the gaggle of corporate executives that had been tapped by the Bush administration to make up the senior civilian leadership at the Pentagon. There was a sort of mixture of people at the Pentagon. On the one hand, you had people from corporate America, from all the defense and weapons manufacturers that were brought in. And then you also had the neoconservative ideologues, people like Paul Wolfowitz. And so Rumsfeld gives a speech in which he literally declared war on the Pentagon bureaucracy, and he said, I've come not to destroy the Pentagon, but to liberate it. We need to save it from itself. And then literally the next day the Pentagon would be attacked. But the vision that Rumsfeld sort of laid out that day would become known as the Rumsfeld Doctrine, where you use high technology, small footprint forces, and increased and accelerated use of private contractors in fighting the wars. It also, at the center of the Rumsfeld Doctrine, became regime change in central strategic nations. Rumsfeld and Cheney both had been signers of the Project for a New American Century that envisioned a new Pearl Harbor as accelerating the agenda, the neoconservative agenda. And indeed, the day after Rumsfeld laid out that plan, the Pentagon was attacked, and all of a sudden the world became a blank canvas on which Rumsfeld and Cheney and Bush could sort of paint their vision. Jeremy
Scahill, you devote a whole chapter to another official within Blackwater, Cofer Black.
Right. I mean, Blackwater is really stacked to the deck. The deck is really stacked in Blackwater's favor in the times that we live in right now. They have several former senior officials from the Bush administration, not from like the Reagan administration, but from the current Bush administration. Among the most prominent, perhaps the biggest power player in Blackwater's arsenal is J. Cofer Black, who was a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, began his career in the 1970s in Africa as the U.S., well, some would say supported the apartheid regime. Others would say did nothing to stop it. So Cofer Black was one of the key CIA people in Africa throughout the 70s and 80s. And he arrived in Sudan in the early 1990s, and he came under diplomatic cover as a sort of diplomat. He was there, but he actually was CIA. And as Black was there, a young Saudi billionaire named Osama bin Laden was building up his international network. And by the time Black would leave Sudan a few years later, the CIA would refer to it as the Ford Foundation of Islamic Terrorism. And so Black and Cofer Black and Osama bin Laden are both operating simultaneously in Khartoum in Sudan in the 1990s. And at one point, there was a plot to kill Cofer Black once bin Laden's group had learned that he was actually CIA. And so they were sort of monitoring each other. And one of Black's operatives in Sudan actually cooked up a plot to kill bin Laden and toss his body over the fence at the Iranian embassy to make it seem like the Iranians had killed bin Laden. But at the time, bin Laden wasn't considered a big fish. The big fish in Sudan was Carlos the Jackal, the famed international terrorist. And so Cofer Black's claim to fame in the 1990s had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden, but had to do with the fact that he was seen as the man who caught Carlos the Jackal. And Black would go on then to serve in Latin America, and just before 9/11, he was tapped to head up the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. And so when the 9/11 attacks happened, Cofer Black was called to the Situation Room in the White House on September 13th, 2001, to lay out for President Bush the CIA plan to go after bin Laden. And he was said to be throwing papers on the ground as he described how they were going to insert special forces into Afghanistan. And he told President Bush that he would bring back Osama bin Laden's head in a box on dry ice. And in fact, those were the orders he gave to his CIA operatives that went in with the Jawbreaker team into Afghanistan after 9/11. And one of them said to Cofer Black, you know, I don't know what we're going to do about dry ice in the field, but we certainly can get a cardboard box. Cofer Black became known in the administration as the flies on the eyeballs guy because he would talk in these sort of messianic terms about the mission that they were about to undertake and said when we're through with them, they'll have flies crawling across their eyeballs. He told Russian diplomats, we're going to stick their heads on pikes in the field. This is now the guy who went on after 9/11 to really accelerate the use of extraordinary renditions, the capturing of people, putting hoods on them, putting diapers on them, sending them on these long flights to third countries where they're asked a series of questions provided by U.S. interrogators and where they're tortured and humiliated and broken down. People like Maher Arar, who you've covered extensively on this show.
Cofer Black is now part of a new Blackwater effort, a new company called Total Intelligence Solutions.
Right. This is really the next sort of generation of privatization, is the privatization of intelligence, and they're marketing their services to Fortune 500 companies. And so it's not just Cofer Black. It's another CIA guy who went on to work at Blackwater, Robert Richer, who was an assistant, was a deputy director of operations at the CIA. So those two are really the the sort of leaders behind this new initiative. But really, the man behind all of it is Erik Prince, the head of Blackwater. He's rapidly buying up, for instance, a think tank, the Terrorism Research Center, and other intelligence entities, and sort of cobbling them together. Blackwater's big push now is not just for government contracts, but is also for corporate contracts. And so it's part of this radical privatization agenda. And to have a man heading this who told Congress openly there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. This is a guy who ran, essentially, the Extraordinary Rendition Program, now is working as the vice chairman of Blackwater and starting his own private intelligence company. Blackwater has a fleet of more than 20 aircraft. Many of them sort of fit the patterns of planes used in Extraordinary Rendition. Now, we don't have any direct evidence to suggest that Blackwater's planes have been used in Extraordinary Renditions, but the types of planes that they have and the flight patterns that they engage in are very similar to some that have been documented to be engaged in Extraordinary Rendition. So this raises a lot of serious questions about the extent of Blackwater's involvement.